It is what Palestinians need to ignite the hope. Two states cannot happen without that hope to unite Palestinians behind a final cause that will stop the killing for good. War has to stop, yes, but that is not peace. Peace is two states. And he knows that Netanyahu rejects it. So when he spoke to Netanyahu, did he mention and speak about the two-state solution, and in particular the recognition of Palestine? And does he not accept that if the UK followed the other 140 countries that have done this, that would send a powerful message to both the Palestinian people, but Netanyahu as well?
Well, could I reassure the Honourable Lady that raising this issue does not test my patience? And she is absolutely right. I reject and disagree with those in Israel that say there can be no two-state solution, because if there's no two-state solution, then there is either one state or no state at all, Mr. Speaker. So I recognise why this is a pressing issue, and she can raise it, but as I've said, we will do it at the appropriate moment, hopefully working with other partners as a road to that two states that we desire.
Debbie Abrahams.
Two, please, Mr. Speaker.
In my second week in the role, I travelled to Israel and to the West Bank and called an immediate ceasefire, something none of my predecessors had done. And in my meetings with both leaders, I called for an immediate ceasefire and made the urgent case, as has been described, for a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I welcome my right honourable friend and all the team to their place. And as well, I'd like to thank him for calling for the ceasefire when he did visit Israel. That has had a profound impact in my constituency. Does he agree, though, that a permanent ceasefire in Gaza is not only essential for the future of people in Gaza, but would also help to cool tensions in the Middle East, particularly given the attack on the Golan Heights and the tensions that are escalating between Hezbollah, Israel, and even Hutus as well?
Secretary.
Well, my Honourable Fred is right. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable. The war needs to end now. And it is also the case that given the escalation of tensions in the region, if that Biden plan is adopted by both sides, we would see that escalation come down. And so for life in Gaza, but also across the region, it is important that that plan is adopted now.
Gordon McKay.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 4, 5, 6, 10, 15 and 22 together. The people of Gaza face a humanitarian catastrophe. Humanitarian aid is a moral necessity. Almost 90% of the population in Gaza have been displaced, and the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification's recent famine risk assessment found there was a risk of famine across the whole of Gaza.
McKay.
Can I thank the Minister for her answer? Last week I met with the Palestinian ambassador to discuss the heartbreaking crisis in Gaza. Since April, the volume of aid cargo entering the Gaza Strip has decreased by around 50% at the same time as hospitals remain damaged or in many cases destroyed. That's why I welcome the Foreign Secretary's commitment to resume UNRWA funding and his demands for a ceasefire in the region. So can I ask the Minister, having resumed that funding, what steps the Government are taking to allow this vital aid into Gaza and help those so desperately in need?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue, and we are deeply concerned at a number of the developments that he mentions. The UK is providing and will continue to provide significant humanitarian support to Gaza. However, we are also clear Israel must meet its commitment to flood Gaza with aid. It is vital.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I very much welcome the Foreign Secretary's decisions on the International Criminal Court and on UNRWA funding. This morning I met with Oxfam, and they told myself and other members of this House that they predict that in this summer, when Parliament's in recess, up to 7,000 people in Gaza will be killed or injured, up to a third of them children. Given this, can the Minister outline what urgent steps the government will take this summer in order to end this horror, including ending UK arms sales to Israel?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, too many people have died in Gaza and too little aid is getting in. We are clear that Israel must take concrete steps to protect civilians and aid workers in accordance with international humanitarian law. This includes deconfliction between military and humanitarian operations and supporting the minimum operating requirements of the UN agencies, as well as, of course, the other matters that my honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, laid out, including the need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire.
Deirdre Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week I met with some of my constituents in Ealing Southall who live in the Hanwell Broadway area, and they told me about Hanwell Friends of Sabastia, a friendship and support network between our corner of West London and a village in the north of the West Bank. So my constituents have heard firsthand how Palestinians are suffering across the territory. Could I ask what difference this decision to restart funding for UNRWA, the UN aid agency, will make to the lives of ordinary Palestinians, and what discussions she has had with UNRWA's Commissioner General to maximise that impact on the Palestinian people?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this matter, because we are clear that UNRWA is the only humanitarian organisation that's able to operate at the scale required in Gaza. Now, the Foreign Secretary, as members will be aware, confirmed to the House on the 19th of July that the UK would resume funding to UNRWA. On the same day, I met with the UNRWA Commissioner General, Philippe Lazzarini, to understand more from him about the situation on the ground, but also reforms that UNRWA itself is undertaking. We also talked about this government's release of £21 million in new funds to UNRWA to support its life-saving work in Gaza and the provision of basic services in the region.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituents in Aylesbury are appalled by the death and destruction in Gaza. They know, like we do, that only an immediate permanent ceasefire in exchange for the return of the hostages will put an end to this unacceptable and unbearable suffering. In the meantime, the Minister referenced the Israeli government's promise to flood Gaza with aid. The reality is that they are putting in place repeated and deadly obstructions. What conversations has the government had with Israel to ensure that the Israelis end this denial of life-saving assistance?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to my honourable friend for a question. I know she has a personal interest in this area and indeed experience from humanitarian work before she came in to this place. Now, when the Foreign Secretary was in Israel, he pressed Prime Minister Netanyahu to open all border crossings, including Rafah, to facilitate a significant increase in aid and to allow the safe, effective distribution of aid within Gaza. We will continue to press urgently for this.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. Despite designating Al-Mawasi as a humanitarian safe zone, there have been multiple Israeli airstrikes which have killed dozens of civilians and wounded many more, and resulted in the bombing of a compound belonging to the charities Medical Aid for Palestine and International Rescue Committee. So can I ask the Minister what discussion she has had with her Israeli counterparts about stopping any further attacks on Al-Mawasi, and where displaced Gazans have been ordered to go by the Israeli Defence Force for their own safety?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm aware this issue is of personal concern to my honourable friend, that he's visited the region many times, including when he was opposition spokesperson for the region. He asked specifically about the issue of civilians within this conflict. We are aware that around 90% of the population within Gaza have now been displaced, some of them more than one time. We are very, very clear. We need to have a situation where civilians are protected, where aid workers are also treated in accordance with international humanitarian law. We need to ensure that there is deconfliction, and as I stated before, those are matters that we have been pressing as the new government. Thank you.
Ruth Cabret.
Mr. Speaker, the World Health Organization has warned that the lack of sanitation and clean water due to the humanitarian crisis in Gaza means there's a real risk of polio spreading undetected among the people of Gaza. Will the UK government consider supporting a mass vaccination programme in Gaza?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this matter, and I discussed it, as well as the Foreign Secretary, directly with Dr Tedros, the leader of the World Health Organization, yesterday. She is right about that severe concern around polio, also around the vaccination scheme that the World Health Organization is working on. But I would also point to the fact that when populations are not receiving the food and nutrition that they require, nor clean water, the potential for infectious disease obviously increases. The UK has provided significant support around food and nutrition, other forms of shelter as well, and essential materials. We will continue to do that, and indeed to work with the World Health Organization on these important matters. Thank you.
Kit Malthouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. While the eyes of the world are rightly on the shocking situation, dystopian situation in Gaza, we should not forget the humanitarian situation in the West Bank, where a largely defenceless population is being ever more persecuted, exposed to violence, seeing their homes and land stolen. Can we please have a comprehensive set of sanctions against violent settlers, the organisations that support them in their activities, and those that are complicit at a state level in what they're doing?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Member for raising this issue, and the health and well-being of those in the West Bank was again one of those issues that I discussed with General Lazzarini, obviously from UNRWA, because we are concerned about that situation. We, as one would expect, are keeping all sanctions regimes under review, including this one, and we remain concerned about the situation both for the population but also in terms of the longer term issues around a two-state solution that were referred to previously.
Al Pinkerton.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. And I thank the Secretary. The government have announced a strategic defence review, but the challenges that the UK faces in the mid-21st century are military related, they are development related, and they are diplomatic related. And I would just like assurance that the Foreign Office is going to have a distinct role to play in the strategic defence review, particularly given the light of the conversation that we've just had that shows the complexities of the UK's global posture in the 21st century. Thank you.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for his point. Of course, all of these issues interrelate strongly. We are absolutely determined that we will be working with colleagues in defence, as well as indeed across the whole of government, so that we ensure that we are putting our country's interests first, and above all protecting our security, the first responsibility of any government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In recent months, Hamas have targeted Israel's Kerem Shalom goods crossing with rockets and mortars to prolong the misery of their own people, and are also estimated to have spent $150 million constructing their terror networks, misappropriating aid. So does the Minister accept that Hamas will always prioritise conflict with Israel over the well-being of their own citizens in Gaza, and that more steps need to be taken to stop the misappropriation of aid by Hamas?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the Honourable Member for his question. Of course, aid materials must always be provided directly to those who are in need, particularly in a situation of humanitarian catastrophe, which is the case currently within Gaza. It is incredibly important that food and nutrition, clean water, other forms of sanitation, medicines and shelter are provided directly to those in need. They must not be misappropriated. That is absolutely fundamental. Of course, these are issues that we've discussed, for example, with UNRWA when we met with them, that we have discussed with other aid agencies as well that are involved in the region. Thank you.
Brendan O'Hara.
Speaker, key to ending the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, of course, is to stop selling weapons to those who have shown they're prepared to use them indiscriminately against civilians. It's been suggested that the government will continue to sell defensive weapons, but given that Israel defines its entire campaign as defensive, how do they propose to tell us at the end of the review on international humanitarian law just how many of the 40,000 civilians who have been killed were killed with defensive weapons as opposed to offensive weapons? And on what legal basis would such a determination be made?
The Honourable Member, I believe, will be well aware that this is a legal process. It is one which has to be complied with. This government is absolutely clear that we must act with integrity and ensuring that we are following all of those legal procedures, as indeed the Foreign Secretary set out last week in this House, and as he's just set out this morning. Thank you.
Richard Ford.
Mr. Speaker, as Shadow Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Tottenham urged David Cameron to publish the FCDO's formal legal advice on whether Israel is breaching international humanitarian law in Gaza. As Foreign Secretary, does the new ministerial team still think there is a compelling case to publish the government's legal advice, and will the government be publishing it?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member for his question. The Foreign Secretary has been crystal clear on this, that he will be as transparent as he possibly can. He will ensure that Parliament is fully updated on these matters.
Mr. Speaker, and thank the Minister for that response. Minister, if we want to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza, then it's quite clear what we have to do. What the free world has to do, that's to get rid of Hamas, the murderers and the terrorists that they are. They hide amongst the schools, they hide in the hospitals, they hide amongst the civilians. They are the people that are bringing the death to the Palestine. If the Palestinians, and we want to give them the humanitarian aid that we should, then get rid of Hamas.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful to the honourable member, and of course this government recognises that Hamas has used civilians as human shields. We are deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation. I have set out a few moments ago our response to that. We need to ensure that civilians are protected, and we will continue to press for that as a matter of absolute urgency.
Phil Brickell.
Question number 7, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question, and this government is determined to increase the pressure on Russia and continue to support Ukraine. We will keep our Russia sanctions regime under close review and will go further to reduce Russia's capacity to wage war. The government has already taken early further action, including the EPC, in sanctioning an additional 11 ships as part of efforts to disrupt and deter Russia's shadow fleet. And I, in my early meetings, have raised our Russia sanctions consistently with partners and will continue to work with our closest allies in Europe and the United States.
Brickell.
The UK has sanctioned 2,000 individuals and entities since Russia's unlawful full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Yet, since 2022, there's just been one instance of UK law enforcement securing sanctioned funds. What discussions is the Minister having with counterparts across government to ensure that those who evade sanctions are held to account and that money held unlawfully is secured for the public purse?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his question? It's a very important question. He's absolutely right to raise it, Mr. Speaker. This government will not hesitate to take firm action to close loopholes and to strengthen enforcement of sanctions. He'll understand that I won't comment on future designations or enforcement actions, but as I said, we've already taken some early steps on the shadow fleet. But he is right, there is much more to do, whether to improve compliance or to target those who enable sanctioned individuals to evade our sanctions, and I will of course keep the House closely updated.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Can I thank the Foreign Secretary for his early statement calling on the Russian government to release British citizen Vladimir Kara-Murza, Will he look at what further sanctions might be used to put pressure on the Russian government to release him and other political prisoners like the American journalist Evan Gershkovich?
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for this very, very important question. He's absolutely right to raise it. We call for the release of all those detained in Russia on political grounds, including those imprisoned for their opposition to Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. And we've met with many of the families of those concerned and will continue to take this very, very seriously.
Shadow Minister Dame Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And can I start by congratulating the Minister on his appointment? I know how hard he worked on this brief in opposition. And he will know that the longer Russian sanctions are in place, the more creative Russia becomes at circumventing them. What steps do he and the Foreign Secretary plan to take to end the UK's indirect import of Russian crude oil via the 3 refineries at Jamnagar, Vadinar and New Mangalore? And did he discuss this issue, or did the Foreign Secretary discuss this issue when he travelled to see our Commonwealth friends in India last week?
Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and it's a pleasure to see her in her position and to have worked with her many times on these issues in the past, across these benches, but also in other formats, Mr. Speaker. As I already outlined, and indeed as the Foreign Secretary outlined, we took robust action against Russia's shadow fleet alongside allies in the European political community. We will continue to explore further options to strengthen our sanctions, including in the energy sector, and indeed the Foreign Secretary did raise this at his meetings in Mangalore.
Gregor Ponton.
Number 8, Mr. Speaker.
I met my Indian counterpart, Dr. Jaisankar, in Delhi on the 24th of July. We discussed how to unlock the potential of the UK-India relationship for economic growth and to develop a stronger, deeper partnership to reinvigorate that relationship. I was very pleased to launch the Tech and Security Initiative, which brings together businesses across our two countries working in these areas.
Boynton.
Great. I'd like to thank the Right Honourable friend for his response. I recently met with a number of members of the growing Indian population in my constituency of Livingston, and they were very clear with me that if we get our India-UK relations right over the coming 4 or 5 years, that will be a huge benefit to both countries. So I'd like to ask the Foreign Secretary, does he agree with me that the signing of the Technology and Security Initiative within just a month of office, so that we're working internationally to drive our economy and secure our country?
Well, very grateful to my honourable friend. He'll be pleased that the Trade Secretary announced the government's intention to continue trade talks with India just yesterday. I'm sure there's more we can do to reduce barriers between our two countries.
Blackman.
Thank you, Speaker. When the Right Honourable Gentleman visited India, clearly the last government had got a long way down a free trade agreement, but it was stalled because of the Indian general election and then our general election. There are some sticking points, and I wonder if he could update the House on his discussions on removing those sticking points so we can actually unlock the free trade deal that both sides of this House want to see.
Well, the honourable gentleman has great experience in these matters. I disagree with him slightly because he'll remember that the last government set a timetable and said we would have a trade agreement by Diwali. And I'm afraid the question is which one, because successive Diwalis passed and we didn't get one. But I was very pleased that the Trade Secretary set out that we are going to continue negotiations. And of course these issues came up with my counterpart in Delhi.
We come to Shadows Minister Alicia Kearns. And well,
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Foreign Secretary rightly visited India to discuss a trade agreement between our countries. His party regularly called for human rights to be part of that UK-India trade deal. So can he update the House on whether he secured said agreement during his visit? Now, on human rights, we on these benches welcome the Foreign Secretary raising with his counterparts the case of Jagtar Singh Johal, a British national who the UN has determined to be arbitrarily detained, and there were reports that he was subject to torture. Can the Right Honourable Gentleman confirm today before the House that he still believes, as he did a month ago, that Jagtar is being arbitrarily detained? And will he today publicly call for Jagtar's release, just as he urged from this dispatch box repeatedly the last Foreign Secretary? Will he meet with Jagtar's family as Lord Cameron did? And finally, having adopted the Foreign Affairs Committee's recommendation of a special envoy for Britain's wrongly detained abroad, when will he be announcing that somebody has been appointed?
What can I say to the Right Honourable Lady who has raised these issues over many years, that this is a very serious case, and I remain absolutely committed to pushing for a faster progress and to resolve it. I did, of course, raise the issue with the Minister for External Affairs in India last week. We continue to raise our concerns, particularly about allegations of torture and the right to a fair trial, and of course I will meet with the family over the coming weeks.
Tom Gordon.
Question 9, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, Iran's continued repression of women and girls, ethnic and religious minorities, and human rights defenders is unacceptable. We will continue to work with international partners to hold the regime to account, including at the UN Third Committee later this year.
Dan Gordon.
Mr. Speaker, the Iranian authorities have been systematically targeting BBC Persian staff and their families in an attempt to intimidate them into stopping their work as journalists. Freedom of the press is a fundamental right for people all over the world. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Foreign Secretary and his colleagues commit to working across government with the Culture Secretary to revisit the previous cuts to BBC Persia and look to increase funding for vital work the service does?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a very important question. Iran clearly remains an extremely hostile environment for journalists who face harassment, arbitrary detention and long prison sentences. We'll be raising this issue with the new Iranian government when it's formed. The honourable member will know that they are having their inauguration today, so there are no ministers yet for me or the rest of the Foreign Office team to talk to. On the question of the BBC World Service, the Foreign Office currently provides a quarter of their budget, and we will no doubt be looking at this as part of the wider budget review.
Anton Linson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the Minister to his place. As we were tragically reminded again this weekend, the IRGC is a destructive, malign and terrorist force that is operating through proxies in the Middle East, including Hamas and Hezbollah. Will the Minister please update the House on the work that is ongoing to proscribe the IRGC, something which sadly the opposition failed to do when they were in government? And will he please reassure the House that the UK continues to stand shoulder to shoulder with Israel against their continued aggression?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable friend for the question. This government recognises the threats that IRGC poses. We will take the necessary measures to counter it at home and abroad. We'll keep the list of prescribed terrorist organisations under careful review, but it would not be appropriate to comment on whether or not an organisation is under consideration at this time. Iran continues to destabilise the Middle East through its support to its proxies and partners, and we will work with international partners to challenge this destabilising activity.
Alistair Strathern.
Number 11, please, Mr. Speaker.
Well, one of my predecessors, Ernest Bevin, was instrumental in setting up NATO in the first place, and that's why our commitment to NATO is unshakable. The Washington summit demonstrated that NATO is bigger, stronger and more united than ever, and the Prime Minister and the Defence Secretary continue to engage with allies, and we're very pleased to make our commitment to 2.5% of GDP for defence spending.
Alistair Strathern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Some of my proudest moments in my admittedly reasonably short time as an MP so far have been joining my communities back in Shefford to commemorate the incredible role played not just by British but Allied troops based in our local bases in supporting our way of life through the wars. It's in that spirit that I welcome and celebrate Britain's renewed commitment to NATO on the Labour, but with the previous government having failed to deliver that crucial 2.5% spending commitment. Will the Secretary of State commit to working with ministers as soon as the defence review is completed to ensure we've got a timeline to delivering on that as soon as financially possible?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right to pay tribute to the work of our armed services and all of our veterans, and I thank him for doing that in the House today. And we have undertaken a strategic defence review and also to ensure that we set out a timetable to get to that 2.5% of GDP out of the appropriate fiscal event in the coming months.
Julian Lewis.
Does the Foreign Secretary share my concern that the dominant strand in the US Republican Party is at the moment falling into the trap of renewed isolationism? And what can we do to try and impress on our American allies that if they turn away from NATO, they will only postpone a conflict that could otherwise be avoided completely?
Foreign Secretary.
Well, I know that the Right Honourable Gentleman speaks from immense experience on these matters. He will recognise that there are a range of opinions on these issues within both political parties in the United States. I was very pleased to see that Donald Trump spoke recently to Zelensky, and that the supplemental of £61 billion worth of aid to Ukraine was found recently.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that Ukraine's joining of NATO is absolutely vital to not only Ukraine's security, but also to all European countries' security?
Well, very grateful to my honourable friend for the question. It was absolutely right that at NATO we were able to set out that irreversible pathway to membership for Ukraine, and that NATO was able to come together and speak with one voice.
Stuart Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to have served on NATO operations in both Bosnia and Kosovo, and the 2.5% commitment will strengthen our ties within NATO,
Can the Foreign Secretary commit to a timeline at the earliest opportunity to ensure we don't have to cancel any defence projects and ensure that we have the 2.5% of GDP on defence spending ASAP?
Well, can I thank the honourable gentleman and the honourable gentleman that spoke before him for his service on these matters. Can I just gently remind him that the last government to get to 2.5% of spending on defence was a Labour government. We intend to get back there, and those plans will be announced at a fiscal event in the future.
Tracy Gilbert.
Question number 12, Mr. Speaker.
As soon as I came into office, I commissioned new advice on Israel's compliance with international humanitarian law in the context of war in Gaza. We are obliged to look at that advice under criterion 2C for items exported. This is an ongoing process. I pledge to update the House as soon as I can on this very, very serious matter.
Tracy Gilbert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the change in approach from the government on this devastating conflict in Gaza, and that the review was ordered soon after the Foreign Secretary's appointment. If the review were to conclude that Israel was breaching international law, can the Foreign Secretary confirm that all actions, including halting arms sales, would be considered as part of the government's proportional response?
Well, can I say to the Honourable Lady that the criteria under 2C of our strategic exporting licensing is a clear risk of breach of international humanitarian law. Careful assessments have to be made. There is then a legal process to enable me to meet that conclusion. And of course, with all sobriety and integrity, I intend to do that and update the House as soon as I can.
Councillor Khan.
13, Mr. Speaker.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'll answer questions 13 and 16 together. We've been clear that the government must uphold both our domestic and international legal obligations. The UK respects the independence of the ICJ. We received the advisory opinion in the question on the 19th of July and issued a statement which made clear that we will consider the advisory opinion carefully before responding. My colleagues on the front bench have already made clear our opposition to violence from settlers on the West Bank, and I'm happy to expand on that point if the questioners would like.
Come.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the Foreign Secretary for showing bold leadership and unequivocal support for international law by dropping the previous government's opposition to the arrest warrant against Netanyahu. The ICJ's historic advisory opinion earlier this month made clear that Israel's occupation and annexation of Palestinian territories are unlawful, something many of us have been campaigning against. What steps is the Foreign Secretary taking to ensure Israel ends its unlawful occupation, particularly the recent expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank and the annexation of East Jerusalem?
Thank you to my honourable friend for his question. I know he cares about these issues deeply. The Foreign Secretary visited the region within a week of taking office, and he has raised these precise issues with the Israeli authorities. I reiterate that we are strongly opposed to the expansion of illegal settlements and rising settler violence. More land has been declared by Israel in the West Bank as state lands this year than in any time since the Oslo Accords. The British government already has sanctions against 8 people and 2 groups in relation to settlers in the West Bank, and we will be looking at all options for tougher action on issues facing the West Bank.
Corbyn.
Can the Minister be clear? The judgment or the opinion given by the ICJ is quite clearly that the occupation of Gaza, the West Bank and East Jerusalem is illegal. The settlement policy is illegal. Does the government accept that view? In accepting that view, what actions are they going to take to ensure that appropriate sanctions are made against Israel, including ending arms supplies to them, to ensure that that judgment is carried out and the people of Palestine will be able to live in peace and not under occupation?
I thank the Right Honourable Member for his question. This is an extremely complex finding of 90 pages issued after considerable deliberations by the ICJ. with a variety of views from the judges. As we said at the time, it will take us some time to respond to the full judgment, and we'll update this House when we're in a position to do so. Sanctions will remain under review, as I've discussed in the previous answer.
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Bangladesh is an important Commonwealth friend. However, we do remain deeply concerned about the recent events, and I thank the many members across this House who have raised it with the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office. I spoke to the Bangladesh High Commissioner on the 19th and 23rd of July, and then on the 22nd of July, my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, called for an end to the violence and for democratic reforms and the rule of law to be protected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the high death toll among student protesters, international human rights bodies are reporting further crackdowns on dissent, from mass arrests and enforced disappearances to torture and unlawful killings. Does the Minister agree with me that Bangladeshi people must have the right to exercise their fundamental human rights, including the right to protest, and will she join with me in expressing solidarity with Bangladeshi people in Bangladesh but also around the world facing repression?
She is an excellent champion for her constituents, and the UK and international partners continue to push for progress towards accountability and justice, including through an independent, impartial and transparent investigation into alleged human rights violations.
Dame Caroline Dinich.
Number 17, Mr. Speaker.
Give me. Oh dear. I was pleased that at the NATO conference we were able to come together as all nations and reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine, and that we took great heart from Zelensky speaking to the cabinet for the first time and being united that we continue to stand with the people of Ukraine.
Dame Caroline Dinich.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and of course I welcome his commitment and the government's commitment to supporting Ukraine, and the provision of military aid and humanitarian aid is important, but sadly it won't be enough to secure long-term peace. So will he reassure me that if and when Ukraine seek peace talks, the UK will stand by them and support them absolutely in their efforts to bring this wasteful and terrible war to a conclusion?
Well, can I say to the Right Honourable Lady that I welcome the Ukrainians' desire to have peace summits and to see so many nations come together to discuss the issues that are pertinent to getting that peace. She knows that the best way to achieve peace is for Russia to leave, and that we continue to stand with Ukraine. And just as we committed in opposition for this to be a cross-party issue, I'm very grateful that the honourable gentlemen in the front bench are ensuring that this remains a bipartisan issue here in the UK Parliament.
Shadow Minister Paul Holmes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I welcome the Secretary of State and all ministers to the front bench, and I look forward to working with them. Can the Secretary of State reassure the House that he is working flat out, as was the last government, to make sure that the roughly £2 billion of funds generated from the sale of Chelsea Football Club gets distributed urgently and reaches those in desperate need of humanitarian assistance due to Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine? And does the Minister agree that Chelsea FC is effectively now one of the largest charitable organisations in the country, and the sooner the funds are mobilised, the better?
It's an ongoing and complex issue. We endeavour to do the best that we can at pace, unpicking much that happened previously under the previous government.
We now come to topicals. Lloyd Hatton.
Topical 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government is reconnecting Britain with the world in European capitals, at NATO and in Blenheim. I've been resetting relations with Europe and reinforcing support for Ukraine. I've also deepened partnerships with the Global South to tackle the climate crisis and unlock economic growth. And I'm taking a balanced approach on the Middle East, calling for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and more aid into Gaza.
A builder living on Portland, a B&B owner in Weymouth, or a shopkeeper on Swanage High Street all pay their fair share of tax. And yet some individuals take advantage of offshore tax havens, such as the BVI, to avoid paying their fair share. My constituents play by the rules. We ought to know a bit more about those who choose not to. So can the Secretary of State set out what steps his department is taken to throw open the books in British tax havens and implement public registers of beneficial ownership?
I raised this issue in opposition. I think it was the last speech I gave before the election. It's an issue that I intend to take up with full vigour. We were concerned that parts of the last government were turning a blind eye to these issues, and I hope to come forward with further proposals in the coming weeks.
We come to Shadow Foreign Secretary Andrew Mitch.
And he'll get full support from this side of the House in imposing open registers of beneficial ownership on the overseas territories. Can I ask the Foreign Secretary to pay special attention to Sudan, which is suffering the largest displacement crisis in the world? There is clear evidence of ethnic cleansing once again in Darfur, and the human misery, which I saw on the border with Chad earlier this year, is amongst the most harrowing I've ever seen.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for raising the issue of Sudan. I was able to raise this issue with G7 foreign ministers in my first days in office, and I continue in discussion with the United States, who, as you know, have summoned a gathering in Switzerland to try and achieve that peace.
Drew Mitchell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Both main parties committed in their manifestos to restore the 0.7% international development target. And as you will have seen, last year we reached nearly 0.6%. So will you discuss with the Treasury returning to 0.7, not in one bite, but over the next 2 years? This would secure best value for money for British taxpayers and also help those most in need.
Well, I paid tribute to the Honourable Gentleman earlier, but this is one area that was left in a mess because, frankly, 3.4 billion being spent on refugees in hotels is a lion's share of that amount. It's a lot for myself and my honourable friend, the Overseas Development Secretary, to deal with, but we will do all we can to get back to that 0.7% as soon as possible.
Imran Hussain.
Mr. Speaker, next week marks 5 years since the illegal revocation of Article 370 and 35A, taking away what little autonomy the Kashmiris had and paving the way for further persecution of the Kashmiris by the Indian Armed Forces. So will the Minister make clear she's committed to upholding international law and confirm that the UK will uphold UN Resolution 47 that demands the birthright of the Kashmiris to a free and fair plebiscite?
Thank the Honourable Member for Bradford for his passionate defence of human rights in Kashmir, and he, of course, understands the UK Government position that all countries should respect sovereignty, human rights, the rule of law, and we push all parties to work towards upholding United Nations resolutions.
The Democrats spokesperson Layla Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This weekend we saw an escalation across the UN blue line when Hezbollah and Israel were exchanging rocket fire. 12 Druze children tragically lost their lives. One child dying in war is too many, no matter what nationality they may be. But this region is a tinderbox. What is the Foreign Secretary doing to calm the area now that we have seen an escalation? Because surely that would be a disaster for the region.
Foreign Secretary.
Well, the Honourable Lady is right. The situation on the de facto border between Lebanon and Israel is very concerning. We urge all parties to act with caution. The UK condemns the strike in the Golan Heights that has tragically claimed the lives of 12 people. Hezbollah must cease their attacks and their destabilising activity. I was pleased to speak to the Prime Minister yesterday, and there will be more that I will say on Lebanon in the coming hours.
On the 19th of July, the Foreign Secretary stated that 500,000 people in Gaza are at phase 5 of acute food insecurity, the classification definition that indicates starvation and famine. UNICEF had already reported 29 children have died from malnutrition. How does the government plan to change this reality as Palestinians face the harrowing reality of death by starvation because of a political choice?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for raising this issue. We discussed it obviously previously within this session. We're deeply concerned about the humanitarian situation within Gaza. We have obviously reflected that in our policy response, but also in our humanitarian response as well. That's included, for example, the statement that was made by the Foreign Secretary on his visit to the region, where he committed £5.5 million to UK Med. They're providing a field hospital on the ground, which is desperately needed. We've also ensured that there will be continued provision of the items of medicine and food and nutrition that's required, and play our part in that. Thank you.
In room.
Mr. Speaker, the united support for Ukraine is not shared in the United States, with worrying comments by the Republican vice presidential candidate. So, Mr. Speaker, I know the Foreign Secretary knows Mr. Vance. Can he tell the House what assurances he has from him regarding financial and military support for Ukraine should Trump win?
Well, can I say to my honourable friend that the US has committed over £135 billion in support for Ukraine, including the £61 billion supplemental for Ukraine, and we thank them for that. I was very pleased to meet with JD Vance at the Munich conference and then subsequently in Washington, DC, and I continue to have a good conversation with him about these very important issues.
Ola Barton.
Speaker, the destruction and loss of life in Bangladesh is of grave concern to me and a great number of my constituents. I welcome the Minister's conversations that she has already had with Bangladeshi counterparts in urging for calm. Can the Minister advise what measures are being taken to support British nationals in Bangladesh? And will she join me in thanking the Bangladeshi community in my constituency of Liverpool Wavertree, who contributes so much to our city?
I thank my honourable friend for being so active on this issue, including at the parliamentary engagement on Bangladesh last week. The UK is deeply concerned by the violence by state and state-sponsored actors, and we have updated the travel advice, and all of the information is available on the FCDO website, and we will be very open to taking personal emails from her or any other members who have constituents who have got concerns either in Bangladesh or in the UK.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In quick succession, this new government has renewed unconditional funding for UNRWA despite the Hamas links. It's also endorsed the ICC's very controversial case. Following Hezbollah's attacks at the weekend, will the government reflect on the step-by-step abandonment of one of our closest allies in the Middle East and the potential impact that this could have on continuing rather than curtailing conflict and delaying the peace settlement that we all want to see in the Middle East?
Can I say to the honourable gentleman, there is absolutely no abandonment of our close ties and our relationship with Israel, and it was hugely important for me to speak to both the Prime Minister and the President to reiterate that, of course. But it was also right in reflecting on the work of Madame Colonna and her report, and I urge him to read the report and read the recommendations, that like all of the rest of our international allies, that we do come forward with the funding. We did that with an extra 21 million. And can I remind him that $1 million of that is to ensure that those recommendations are implemented, to ensure the neutrality of UNRWA.
Bergen.
Mr. Speaker, what steps is the government taking to ensure that Israel complies with its international legal obligations following the recent rulings by the International Court of Justice?
I know my honourable friend has taken up these issues time and time again from the dispatch box. Let me make clear, the expansion that we have seen this year is entirely unacceptable. It's more than the last 20 years that we've seen combined. We are keeping these issues under review, and of course I raised that with Prime Minister Netanyahu when I saw him in Israel.
Manuela Portugala.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the government commit to do whatever it can to urgently secure an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, get the hostages home, and to re-establish as soon as possible a dedicated peace process to set us on the path to a two-state solution raised by many of my honourable friends today, including the member for Oxford West and Abington?
Well, I think the Honourable Lady speaks for the whole House in the way that she has put her comments, and I give her that undertaking.
Kate Osborne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Can the Minister tell me what steps are being taken to support peace and human rights in Colombia? And as the penholder for the UN Security Council, can the Minister say more about what steps the government can take or any new initiatives to support the full implementation of the 2016 Colombian Peace Agreement?
Thank the Honourable Lady for her question. I know that she has visited the region and has a keen interest in it. Colombia, of course, is one of the 32 countries currently designated by the FCDO as a human rights priority country. We work closely with the government and communities, including Indigenous communities, to work on violence against women and girls, and the UK has committed £80 million towards peace, stability and human rights, working together with civil society across the piece.
Sir Roger Gale.
Mr. Speaker, this summer marks the 50th anniversary of the illegal occupation and invasion by Turkey of the northern part of the island of Cyprus. The Foreign Secretary tell the House what steps, what initiatives his government is going to take to seek to resolve that frozen conflict for which the British government does have a historic responsibility as a guarantor power.
Well, can I thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for his very important question, and well aware of his interest on this issue over many years. We remain committed as a government to a bizonal, bicommunal federation on the basis of political equality, adherence to United Nations Security Council resolutions, and will continue to engage with the United Nations envoy and the UN process on this important matter.
David Taylor.
Can I ask the Minister what assessment they've made of the potential implications of asylum accommodation policy of using the overseas development budget to help fund asylum accommodation?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government is committed to restoring overseas development assistance, as we mentioned before, to 0.7% of GNI as soon as fiscal circumstances allow, and overall to restoring our development reputation and reconnecting our country to countries in the global south. Now, the delivery of aid by this government is made more challenging by what took place previously, the uncontrolled expansion of so-called in-donor refugee costs. In 2023, the UK spent £4.3 billion of overseas development assistance on in-donor refugee costs. That's 27.9% of UK ODA. We are determined to ensure that we do not have the kind of unplanned reductions we saw before. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps will the British government be taking following the highly disputed election result in Venezuela of election of President Maduro, in working with our American colleagues over the disputed land in Guyana to prevent any incursion there?
Well, I thank the Honourable Gentleman for raising these issues. It's of huge concern, this disputed election that has taken place in the last few days, and I issued a statement yesterday. And of course, there is ongoing discussions with our American friends and indeed with the state of Guyana, given the threats that we've seen from Maduro in the past. I'm very grateful for the question.
Ben Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now that it's just been revealed that the UK has fallen out of the top 10 manufacturers globally, does my right honourable friend agree that strengthening our country's trading relationship with the European Union for goods as well as for services needs to be an essential part of achieving the government's ambitions for growing the economy?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right that our biggest trading relationship is with the European Union, and he will know that the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson got the paper-thin deal that he did. We haven't yet got a new commission in place. We are absolutely committed to a new veterinary deal and to dealing with the issues of qualifications particularly, but we will take forward discussions with the European Union in good spirit in the coming months as soon as they're in place.
Sir Gavin Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ethiopia is on the cusp of recognising the Republic of Somaliland, and I would ask the Minister to look at where British policy is to make sure it reflects the new reality, and I'd ask if she would maybe have time to meet with me to discuss how we can strengthen and deepen our relationship between Britain and the Republic of Somaliland. Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. The UK has encouraged dialogue between Ethiopia and Somalia. When it comes to this issue of the Ethiopia-Somaliland Memorandum of Understanding, we've also expressed our full respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Federal Republic of Somalia. Of course, I would be happy to meet with him on any issue, including this one. Thank you.
Alex Sobel.
Thank you. I welcome my honourable friend and his team to their places. I've discussed with many of them the chronic human rights situation in West Papua over many years. In 2019, President Widodo invited the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit West Papua. That visit has not yet taken place. What steps is the government taking to ensure that visit takes place, both the Indonesian government and with the United Nations?
I thank my honourable friend for his inter-parliamentary work on this important question. The UK strongly supports the efforts of the authorities and civil society to address the legitimate concerns of the people of Papua, as he's highlighted many times in this House. We continue to monitor the situation in Papua, including the ongoing issue of internal civil displacement caused by clashes between separatists and Indonesian security forces in Papua. The UK remains supportive of a visit by the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights.
Mr. Speaker, has the Foreign Secretary had an opportunity to meet with his counterpart in the Irish Republic, given the ministerial statements there in recent months regarding the thousands of people that they believe to be there illegally, that they say have come from the United Kingdom, and what can be done to try and resolve that matter in a way that will satisfy both nations?
Well, I was very pleased, alongside the Prime Minister, to meet with the Irish Taoiseach and to discuss these and other issues.
You and I are both old enough to remember Tiananmen Square. The use of lethal force on student protesters in Bangladesh has rightly been condemned by our government. Can I urge that the Bangladeshi investigation, that they put pressure on that it has an international element, because a country that can just turn off all communications with the outside world and controls all institutions right down to their stormtrooper-like police shouldn't just be allowed to mark its own homework.
My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, has been very clear that what has happened in the last couple of weeks in Bangladesh is not acceptable, and we've raised that on a number of occasions, including the nature of the judicial review which is currently being undertaken by the government of Bangladesh.
Dance.
A 25-year-old constituent of mine went missing on the evening of Saturday the 13th of July in Sardinia. The Italian authorities called off the search on Friday. So, Mr. Speaker, will the Foreign Secretary meet with me to urge the Italian authorities to help find my constituent?
Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for representing the concerns of his constituent's family. I recognise this is a very, very distressing time for them. He will know that consular officials are providing support to the family and have remained in regular contact with the authorities in Italy. The Ambassador has raised this case with the Italian authorities. They've ended the active search, but the investigation is ongoing, and I'd be very happy to meet with him to discuss it further.
Can I thank the Secretary? Can I thank the Foreign Secretary and his team for the £500,000 committed to the Caribbean after the devastation on Grenada and Carriacou from Hurricane Beryl? But can I press him and the team with the fact that the Caribbean is at the sharp end of the climate crisis? So can he tell the House what plans he has to advocate at COP29 for a replacement to the £100 billion climate finance deal?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for taking up these issues from the backbenches. He will know that I was dealing with these issues on day one in office. Very sadly, this is the beginning of hurricane season across the region. So I keep in close touch with my Caribbean colleagues and expect to have further conversations later today. And of course, we will be taking up these issues as we head to COP.
Shopkat Adam.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the House will agree with me that the situation in Gaza, and particularly for children, is absolutely horrific, with reports estimating that up to 50,000 children are requiring health-related treatment, and that's not even including conflict-related injuries. Will the Secretary of State agree with me that, along with international partners, we must secure a mechanism that allows these children to be treated here in the UK, especially as many hospital facilities have been erased in Gaza?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue of medical treatment within Gaza is one that this government takes very seriously, including that, of course, for children. We have reflected that in our operation since coming in to offers, particularly around supporting UK Med, which operates a field hospital that the member may be aware of. As I mentioned before, the Foreign Secretary announced £5.5 million going towards its operations. Now, that includes covering support for trauma, other forms of public health as well within Gaza. And we will, of course, keep this under review. There's extreme need. Thank you.
Egan.
All of us here want to see an end to the conflict in Gaza and Israel, and that means getting to a lasting peace as soon as possible. Growing in concern that we're seeing rising hostilities on the north of Israel with Hezbollah, with a deadly increase attacks targeted against civilians. Hezbollah, of course, an Iranian-funded terror group which has entrenched itself in southern Lebanon. Can the Foreign Secretary give us reassurance that Britain will play a full part in working with Israel and other allies to counter this threat?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable friend for the question. Further escalation is in nobody's interests, and can I reassure him, we understand who sits behind Hezbollah, and that is Iran. And they have been engaged in a lot of activity to drive escalation forward in the region. So, of course, I want to give him that reassurance.
Final question, Bob Black.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 111 hostages are unaccounted for in Gaza. Some are foreign nationals, but most are Israeli citizens. Recently, bodies were recovered from under Yunis Khan, the city, demonstrating that Hamas have complete contempt for humanitarian areas. What action is the Foreign Secretary taking to secure the release of the hostages? And will he guarantee that Hamas will play no further part in the governance of a state of Palestine?
I can say to the honourable gentleman, it was very important for me to meet with hostage families when I was in Israel. I've spoken to hostage families since returning back to the country, and of course we are giving all assistance we can to the Israeli authorities to ensure that those hostages get out. And I really want him to understand that we have this as a #1 concern. Those hostages need to be returned.
That completes questions.